friends, I'm Lekshmi, working as Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, University of Kerala, Kariyvattam. So what I would like to do in this short video is to give a very brief account on what feminist ethics is. What I will be doing in the next few minutes is to give a very short introduction on what is feminism and then move on to the very pertinent question, feminist ethics. So to begin with, what is feminism? Feminism is in fact not one single stance or belief, but many. It's an intellectual commitment as well as a political movement. Feminism is, as a movement of philosophy, stands for the social, political and economic equality of men and women. But if I simply say that feminism is a movement which stands for the equality of men and women, that would be too exhaustive a definition on feminism. So feminism is in fact an active commitment to equality and respect for life, respecting all people as well as non-human forms of life and the earth. The term feminism widely occurs in the Western tradition. It was used regularly in English following the French term féministe. In the mid-1800s, feminism was used to refer to the qualities of females. In 1860s, the term womanism was used. So it was the term womanism which came first, and then only the term feminism came. And womanism or feminism is a historically political movement, popularly as it is known, especially in the US and the Europe. But later on, we know it never exhausts in a kind of a political activism or a political movement. And as we move on to the later centuries, we can see that feminism stands more as an intellectual commitment, or I would like to say as a perspective of philosophy. In fact, the context of feminism is global. The meanings of feminism vary. So it should be considered throughout history and across various cultures. So a great number of women in other traditions, for example, Indian, Chinese, all stood for the cause of women, for the justice and liberation of women. Now, in this short video, my concern is to understand why feminist ethics, or what is ethics in the context of feminism, as well as to understand the contemporary significance of feminist ethics. Is feminism exclusively about women? It's not just about women or women's rights, can be the answer. It's a movement about mutuality, communion, and sharing. In fact, it stands for achieving equal rights for women, but it extends to the structure of our society, our culture, the workings of language, and how they shape our perceptions and collective consciousness. Feminism is more about justice to be achieved by ending all kinds of oppression and domination. Feminism is a philosophical perspective. I say this is because it strives for inclusivity and pluralism in our thoughts, in our attitudes, in our belief systems, and in our perspectives. Nowadays, we know it gives way to intersectionality. And Alice Walker, one of the famous thinkers, says that womanism as an alternative to feminism better addresses the problems relating to women as well as feminism. Whenever we discuss about feminism, the waves, the three waves or the four waves, they make its way. So the feminist movement in the US, they came as different waves. The first wave started in mid-19th century, and whenever we speak about first wave feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication of the rights of women, they come into picture. And it stood mainly for this voting rights or the suffrage rights of women. The second wave feminism, it came up between the 1960s or the 1970s, we can say. It was mainly addressing the question why women were oppressed. Traditional gender and family roles were questioned. Then they also stood for a number of institutional reforms. And they also established the queer theory. Moving on to the third wave of feminism, it came about 1990s. It stood for greater equality rights. Then it also addressed the important question of intersectionality, how different kinds of oppression, that is not only the question of gender but also race or language, ethnicity, so many things. So they also intersect with each other. And today there arises the question, has the fourth wave of feminism started? In a way, we can say that feminism is in fact a continual search for the true meanings of empowerment, equality, freedom, justice and liberation, not only of women, but also extending to the other domain of the socio-political or the cultural factors. And feminism is not confined. This is what I would like to highlight. It's not confined to views, but should be considered throughout history and across various cultures. Now, the feminist interventions on philosophy, so they are mainly addressing the question whether the traditional philosophy is patriarchal in nature, or traditional philosophy is neutral or not, or whether the concepts that were used by our great thinkers, maybe Plato or Descartes or Kant for that matter, whether they were in fact universal in their approach, whether they were gender neutral in use while they were using the many philosophical concepts or not. This is one of the interventions where feminists make in philosophy. So the binary oppositions and the meta-narratives of the traditional Western thinking or the Western philosophy in fact reveals the very fact that there are a lot of concepts in the traditional Western thinking which are patriarchal in nature or which are very, very gender sensitive. So feminism as a movement of philosophy intervenes the metaphysical, epistemological, ethical, environmental, social, political, and even other branches of philosophy where how these different concepts are being articulated by the great traditional philosophers. So many of the feminist philosophers, for example, Irigaray or Butler, they try to reread or take a critique of the great works of Plato, and they try to reveal how male-centered or patriarchal these philosophical texts and this philosophical contexts were. Why feminist ethics? When we say feminist ethics, I mean it's not, first of all, it's not a branch of ethics. For example, we have applied ethics or we have bioethics or we have meta-ethics, which I would like to say they are all different branches of ethics. But I think feminist ethics is not yet another branch of ethics, but it's a way of doing ethics. Rather than saying that it is a branch of ethics, it's a way of doing ethics. So does sex matter to one's ethical theorizing is the important question. Because in ethics we have to make moral decisions. Then at times moral judgments are also to be done. So in these aspects, whether sex matters or gender matters, so that is the important issue here. So feminist ethics seeks to understand, correct, critique how gender operates within our moral practices. So the major themes that come under feminist ethics include the binary view of gender, the privilege of men over women, and how ways of gender maintain oppressive social orders, then the question of moral autonomy and moral justification, then situating moral objectivity, and in fact, care ethics. So all these are some of the important aspects that are dealt under the label or under the umbrella term feminist ethics. So throughout history and across cultures, philosophers have attempted to understand the role of gender in moral matters. In the 17th and 18th century, we can see the forerunners of feminist ethics. So women shall be given access to education. Women shall be treated as rational as men, whereby to develop moral character. So it was a customary belief in the society that women are not capable of making rational judgments or making moral choices, because usually women are considered to be more emotive in nature rather than rational. So they lack the moral decision making capacity. So feminists were in fact questioning this kind of an attitude which was prevalent in our social practices. And in 18th century, Wollstonecraft came up with an important observation, I quote, "Women, I allow, may have different duties to fulfill, but they are human duties, and the principles that should regulate the discharge of them must be the same." So it's a passage from A Vindication of the Rights of Women, a great work written in 1792 by Mary Wollstonecraft. Again, during the 18th, 19th centuries, we know the Enlightenment ideal was so prevalent. So the Enlightenment ideal was giving much importance to reason of man. And in fact, they said they stood for humanism, but feminists are asking the very important question whether these moral standards are truly universal in nature or whether they only support a few. So Wollstonecraft and consort, they came up with the view that moral arguments have got ethical double standards on the basis of universal humanism. Whenever we speak about feminist ethics, the first thing that comes to our minds is care ethics, advocated by Carol Gilligan. According to her, there is a significant correlation in gender orientation. That is, it's generally believed that, or we attribute a lot of qualities to the male and the female in general terms. So it is said that males, they have more justice, they stand for rights, autonomy, individuation, they seek abstract principles and universality. On the other hand, women, they do have, or they care more for personal relationships. Then they're very contextual. Then they give high value for interpersonal emotive responses and all these things. Gilligan argues, have distinctive traits but not necessarily inferior to those of men. So society has failed to reward what is distinctively valuable in women's traits. So according to Carol Gilligan, this caring attitude or the nurturing attitude which the women have, which are uniquely or distinctively valuable qualities or attributes in women, that should be properly respected, or that should be properly rewarded. So these feminists mainly stood for women's moral leadership and greater freedom as moral imperatives. So here I would like to mention the names of J.S. Mill and Harriet Taylor. They argued that women ought to have equal rights and equal access to political and social opportunities. In 20th century, Simone de Beauvoir, whom we all know, is the author of The Second Sex and the very beautiful essay on the ethics of ambiguity. I would like to quote the words of Beauvoir. Quote, "One may be born as a human female, but the figure that the human female takes on in society, that of a woman, results from the mediation of another that can constitute an individual as another." Unquote. So if one is to philosophize about women, it's indispensable to understand about the economic and social structure in which women aim to be authentic or ethical, necessitating an existential point of view, taking into account her social situation. Simone de Beauvoir further expresses her concerns or her ethical concerns. According to her, ethical theory must attend to women's social situation, their capacity to be moral decision makers. The oppression of women for a long period of time, in fact, impedes their knowing themselves. So the times of Beauvoir, we know, where like when philosophers try to describe women as lacking morally worth, rational abilities. That is, I already told you that it is usually believed that, or generally believed that, male are rational and the female, or men are rational and women are more emotive. And traditional Western philosophy, and especially modern Western philosophy, we know, it is reason-centered. So that itself shows the patriarchal nature of the traditional Western thinking. And in ethics also, we know, in moral decision making, it is reason that is given much importance. So that again shows that it is men who decide maybe what is right and what is wrong. So moral autonomy, moral justification, situatedness of moral objectivity, care. So these are in fact the concerns of later feminist thinkers. What feminist ethics is in fact doing, it takes a critique of the traditional methodology of the philosophers or the traditional ethicists like Kant, Mill, etc. It questions or takes a methodology of the traditional ethicists like the utilitarians or the Kantians. And again, it searches for an alternative to Kantian ethics, again an alternative to utilitarian ethics. So Kantian ethics, we know, is a kind of a rationalistic ethics where the moral will is nothing but a rational will. And in utilitarianism, it always seeks to prefer the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But the question is how to decide the greatest happiness or the greatest number, or who all come under the greatest number. So that's a concern for feminists. So, in fact, in traditional ethics, there are a lot of impartialities, or we can say there is bias in their claims to universality. Though they claim that the moral standards are highly universal, feminists always question how you came, or how do you measure this universality, or how do you come up with this question of universality. So feminist ethics emphasizes the legitimation of the personal point of view. Then they stand in defense of the role of emotion rather than a reason, especially in moral matters. Then it's a relationally oriented moral psychology. Then it seeks interconnections between the personal and the political. And that is, in fact, one of the criticisms of the feminist ethics against the traditional ethics, they failed or they forgot to address the interconnections between the personal and the political. Again, it stands for a recognition of diversity among women. Moral autonomy is a very important theme coming under ethics. So, self-determination in moral understanding and moral decision making is very, very important. So, because it's a precondition of moral agency and moral responsibility. So, without the question of agency and responsibility, there's no question of ethics. So, Immanuel Kant is considered to be the champion of moral autonomy and who stood for the foundation of moral agency. And he speaks about what are called the categorical imperatives or the moral laws or the unconditional commands on the do's and don'ts of our actions. And all these moral principles or ethical principles are based on reason, and they are considered to be very, very universal, because the very first maxim or the categorical imperative of Kant itself says, act only on that maxim which thou canst will to be universal. So the feminists here take a critique of Kant and they argue, so this Kantian ethics, for that matter, fails to recognize the moral importance of emotions, personal relationships, social relationships, and impartial nature of ethical standpoints. Because Kantian standpoint or ethical standpoint is highly rational and too stringent in its approach. So feminists, they stand for an alternative way of doing ethics by nurturing or by giving much emphasis upon the interpersonal nature of moral reasoning and morality as self-governance. So feminists argue that women are denied of the opportunities to shape morally significant features of their lives. Their own needs and values, that is, the needs of women and their values, are always subordinated, even in their family circumstances. So, subordination to male authority, even in the domestic realm, it's a main concern or a chief concern of the feminists while discussing about feminist ethics. Then, obedience and suspension of independent moral evaluation. Then, if we take the major religions or the societies for that matter, they fail to acknowledge women's moral equality with men as moral agents. So the moral capacities of women as individuals are at least equal to those of men as individuals. So this kind of an outlook should come, or an awareness shall be effected, especially in philosophical perspectives. Then personal moral autonomy is a necessity to resist the oppression and live a life-fulfilling life, especially for women. Now moving on to the question of moral justification. Now when we look at the traditional philosophers, G. Moore, he stood for moral intuitionism and the intrinsic nature of the good. Now, feminists like Elizabeth Anderson, they take a critique of moral intuitionism as incapable of accessing a distinction between objective judgments and subjective preferences. So, thinkers like Moore, they tried to rationalize conventional moral beliefs. Thinkers like R.M. Hare, who stood for universal prescriptivism, came up with the view that people's inclination about important matters of life tend to be the same. So he's trying to make a reductionism or a kind of a universality in moral justification. So feminists argue that Hare's prescriptivism of moral justification does not provide any room for women or the marginalized groups of the society. John Rawls, who wrote A Theory of Justice, is again another thinker who speaks about moral justice, his original position, and the hypothetical situation, that is, no knowledge of our place in the society, or we don't have any prior knowledge of our place in the society, that which he addresses as the veil of ignorance. So in that kind of a hypothetical situation, Rawls argues that the members select the basic principles that determine the basic structure of the society. Now, this kind of a moral justification put forward by Rawls is also criticized by feminist ethicists. So they argue that even Rawlsian views are biased against women for the representative man, according or as held by Rawls, is the head of the household. So again, it's also patriarchal in its nature. Then Habermas, who speaks about discourse ethics, is of the opinion that a norm is right if it is accepted by communicative agents under ideal conditions of justification. And there should be some sort of a domination-free move in moral decision making. Seyla Ben-Habib, a great feminist thinker, holds the view that it is perhaps one of the most promising model of moral justification. So care must be given not to disregard the narratives, vocabularies, or styles of thinking of women in moral justifications. So bias on the basis of race, class, or gender be avoided when we do moral justification. Then it should also never exclude from moral scrutiny aspects of life that are of concern to women or any marginalized section of the society. Then autonomy in the context of social relationships. Here comes the important philosophical question. Are social relationships a barrier or a necessity to autonomy? Personhood is inherently social, or whether personhood requires separatedness from the social. So here we need to redefine selfhood and identity. So here I would like to say that to determine itself, a being must at the very least be a self. So autonomy cannot be realized except in a context of social relationships. So the postmodern deconstruction challenges to the notion of an absolute unified self gains much importance here. Hence, criticisms on moral autonomy arises from feminist thinkers themselves. So they point to a redefining of what moral autonomy is. Now, traditional philosophers, that is from Plato through Kant, maybe up to Habermas, we can say, emphasize moral rationality in justification. So contemporary feminists argue that moral reasoning must not be simply rational in its approach or rationalist in its terms, but it must be pluralist, interactive, and hermeneutic. Emphasis must be given to the social processes rather than on individual capacities, and it demands proficiency in interactive skills and virtues necessary to participate as an equal in productive moral discourses. Dominant vocabularies, as what we find in traditional ethics, may lack the necessary perspectives of the subordinate groups. So that they are always sidelined or those voices are always left unheard. So that should never happen according to feminist ethics. Dominant vocabularies include gender, the male gaze, hostile environment, sexual objectification, and the like. So contemporary feminist ethical positions in fact calls for alternative tools and methodologies for doing ethics. As I have told you at the outset, that feminist ethics is a kind of doing ethics rather than theorizing ethics. So it challenges the canonical accounts of moral autonomy and justification. It's open, egalitarian, transparent, and highly inclusive. Whereas traditional ethics, if looked at from this perspective, one can say that it's exclusive or biased to a great extent. Feminist ethics is highly democratic, participatory, as well as emancipatory in its nature. So let me conclude. Ethics, we can say, is a theoretical enterprise. Speaking in other terms, we can also see it as a way of doing or as a way of life. Feminist ethics needs to be addressed as a way of life, and especially should be addressed from a global perspective. It's not univocal, but multivocal, that calls for cross-cultural practices. Hence, alternative methods and tools are highly suggestive in the context of feminist ethics. Feminist ethicists converge to a single focus: to liberate the subordinate and the marginalized, including women, from the oppressive and decisive tendencies prevailing in the society. Thank you.